Yeah, just thrilled to be here, and I think it's nice that we're all kind of coming together with the same perspective. I think we're all, we all have different roles and we're doing different things, but we're all pretty excited about this human performance space and excited about sport biometrics and measuring things and technology, and yeah, we might all be coming at it from different places, but I think we're all kind of going at the same end goal. So when I was talking to Bob about, kind of thinking about what to talk about today, a lot of topics came up as evaluating technologies and how do we analyze the data and how do we do a lot of things, and I want to take a step back before we get into all of that and just talk about some cultural things and kind of understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And I think a lot of the talks have really harped on that the last day and a half, but I think it's really important, and I, kind of drawing from my perspective on a lot of this is, I'm incredibly lucky to work in this field. So that's first and foremost, is that I found my dream job of what I do day to day, and found my dream location to do it. Moved a little less than a year ago to West Virginia to the Rockefeller Neurosciences Institute. But I didn't even know, like 10 years ago, I didn't know sports science existed. Obviously, sports science has been around for a very long time. Since we've been competing in athletics from the history of the Olympics, we've been trying to get better and optimize performance. But I think sports science as we know it and as it's now becoming a culture and becoming a topic, there's a lot of different ways to get into it. So a little bit of the ways that I just absolutely stumbled my way into this, and I get asked all the time now that sports science is becoming a thing, it's like, hey, I want to hire a sports scientist. What kind of educational background should I look for? And my answer is always yes. Because there's a lot of ways to come at it. Like, there is no degree in sports science. There are a couple overseas. I think that's changing a little bit, but there's a lot of different ways to come at it. And really, when I think about defining sports science, it's how do we use evidence-based practice to enhance performance? That's what we're all trying to do. And you can define performance any way you want to define it. So if you're a rehab doc trying to help somebody recover or cope with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, all the way up to NFL athletes, right? We're trying to optimize performance. So it's how you define it and the steps that you take to do that. That's what we're trying to do. So I kind of started out, I'm an engineer. So if I say anything wrong from physiology, I'm going to use that as my, yeah, this is why I got it wrong. But I think there's a lot of ways to come at it, and we can always learn. So that's kind of my big takeaway is, if you come at it from a technology perspective, you can learn the physiology. If you come at it from a physiology perspective, you can learn the technology. If you come at it from pure data analytics, you have to learn kind of both those spaces. And I think alternatively, if you're on the physiology space or the tech space, you need to learn something on the analytics side. So we need to know, obviously you have different people on your teams to do all these different things, but you need to know all of this. So I was an engineer, and I just got really lucky, and I was a chemical engineer undergraduate, and then worked designing chemical plants and was bored to tears. And I just knew this really funny British dude. Was one of my professors, and he worked at, he did a lot of research for the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and just connected up with him and went to grad school, and just kind of found my way into materials engineering and got into bioelectronics, and then flexible devices became things, so electronic band-aids and things like that. So I was kind of more on the developing technology side, and we're really interested in, sort of they're now becoming kind of midterm, maybe even near-term technologies, but as Mark was talking about, there's lots of great things we can measure in blood and sweat and saliva, and internally, there's a lot of development that still needs to be done. So I was doing a lot of work on that space, really fun stuff, lots of great sweat sensor work that's, that is coming out now, and it's gonna keep coming out. But then kind of like 5 years ago, this explosion of wearables started happening, right? So we all started wearing Fitbits and Jawbone when that was a thing, and iWatches, and companies come and companies go. So that was my opportunity when I was in the DoD to say, let's just understand everything that's out there. And I still remember I was at Starbucks just trying to clear my mind, and I was looking up these back when Adidas made technology products, and they had something that you clip onto your shoe. I was like, I'm gonna buy that. I'm gonna buy everything on the market. I'm gonna figure out what's going on, and I'm gonna use project money to do it, so I don't have to use my own. So I'm kind of a geek. I like technology. So literally just started buying everything and just understanding what's out there, because at that time in the DoD, like if I don't have to create it and put money into developing it, if I can leverage what industry's doing, you see with all these companies out here, like there's a ton going on. And a couple of talks yesterday were like, this is an exciting time. Yeah, it's the Wild West of sports science and the Wild West of technology, and there's a lot out there, and we'll kind of go through how you select some of the things. But we're really lucky, because if that stuff didn't exist, we couldn't do all this fun stuff. And nobody geeks out more than I do when I try to know what everything is going out there. And when I see a new thing and a new shiny object or a new website, I get all fired up, and I can't wait to get it. And then I get a little bit more critical of it when I get more into it. But it's just an exciting time to be in all of this. So when I started buying all these things, then it really became apparent to me of, coming at it from a scientific side as like data quality is number one. I need tons and tons and tons and tons of data. And the very first study we did was on firefighters, and they were all geared up in our lab on a treadmill going to maximal fatigue. I had an IV in their arm. I had sweat patches on. I had every device known to man. It was a great study, but then kind of looking at it and like we got good results, but like, oh, okay, so if all of that works, then now I have to gear this firefighter up with 100 different things. That's not the right way to go. So we need to start thinking about what we're doing. So then I really started getting interested in why are we measuring what we're measuring? So taking a step back and instead of just jumping straight in and buying every single thing that's out there, which would be really fun to do, let's start really understanding what we're doing. And I got really, really lucky in the beginning of 2014. I had this kind of idea. So I was in Ohio, born and raised, about 45 minutes south of Columbus. So I bleed Buckeye football. That's my favorite thing. And now it's the Mountaineers. But it was the greatest thing. So I was like, okay, so what if I can go to a place where they have infinite resources? I want to see how they train their athletes to perform on 12 or 13 Saturdays every year. Best of the best. Money is pretty much no object. What are they doing? And it was also a way for me to just get in there and see something cool. But what happened is I got in there, and they opened up their doors. They were amazing. And Doug Callan was the guy that got me in, the head athletic trainer there at the time. He's still there in an AD role. But they opened everything up, and they just said, hey, here's what it is. And what I found was I just found piles and piles of data. I mean, this is one of the best football programs in the country. They got binders of data. They're measuring all this stuff. They have spreadsheets, all those great things. And I was like, this is awesome. What are you guys doing with that data? I was like, we put it in that binder. It's like, all right, but what do you do with it? I was like, it goes in the binder. It's like, all right. I was like, so how about we make a deal? You give me all that data, and I'll start trying to tell you what it means. At the time, I had no idea what it meant or what I was going to do with it, but I just saw this treasure trove of data, this opportunity to do really, really fun stuff with them. So that kind of expanded sports science and kind of created the sports science, and Jimmy talked about it yesterday at Ohio State and worked with them, and that was just an absolute blast. And working with Mick Marotti, who's the absolute best in the business, was a ton of fun. And then at the same exact time, I got really, really lucky and got to know military group and got to know Mark Stevenson and kind of had the same idea as like, okay, we've got all this data, we've got all these wearables, all these technologies. What if we had this one place where all the data went? And this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And what if we knew everything about that data? And what if we had a red, yellow, green status for exactly where your athlete was at today and what we want to do with them? And that's kind of what I pitched as if like I knew how to do it. But it was more like, let's figure this out together. And it was like, heck yeah, we want that. Let's figure that out. And fast forward today, like we're still not there. Like there still is no red, yellow, green one metric for an athlete because it can't be done. And as Mark stated, there's tons and tons of things that go into that. But we can get really close, and we're doing really good. And it's with all the bright minds in the room and all the technologies and doing things the right way that we can really get to that. So I've been amazingly blessed and privileged to work on the military side, on the athletic side, NCAA, professional. And the reason I say all of that is that I think I have a unique perspective that I've seen a lot of different places, and I've seen things done well. We've had successes. I've had massive failures too. I think a couple other speakers talked about it as well. And I've learned more from my failures. It's painful at the time, but looking back at it, those are the big things that have happened. And one of the simplest pieces of data, the first thing we did in 2014 with the Buckeyes, they won the championship that year, which I had a lot to do with, I'm sure. But it was really simple. It was back when Jawbone was a thing, if you guys remember that. The first activity trackers, and literally we were just looking at their night games, and they had struggled in a couple of their first night games, and then a couple of the players were, when they're getting taped up for the night game, were like, hey, I'm blown out, my legs are tired. And of course, coaching perspective, like, suck it up, you're fine, this is no big deal. And we looked at the data, they had done like 8 miles that day, because it's such a long day, like you're tripling walkthroughs, you're doing all these other things, and it's simple, it's just steps, it's distance, there's nothing, it's not lactate, it's not an implantable. But then they kind of took a look at that data and like, oh, maybe we should change the routine. Maybe we should get these guys off their feet. So after we do walkthrough, let's go to the hotel and get off your feet for a couple hours. And then, I mean, there's lots of other factors. I'm not going to say that's a big thing, but that's just taking a simple piece of data, looking at it, like listening to the athlete, what they're saying, and then providing action. So simple action, simple data, but it was great. And then that same Jawbone on the military group we worked with, we were like, can you use it for sleep and steps and all this stuff. And I think the very first training event they did, they threw them all in the Atlantic Ocean, and half the jawbones came back, half are in the ocean. So that was a fail, but that was a good learning experience. They've got to attach a little bit better. So I'm really lucky now to be at West Virginia, to where I'm still available to work with all the athletes. So working with all the sports, so doing a ton with football, women's soccer there, still doing a lot of work in the military, but now it's opened up a clinical population. So now, as I talk about defining performance across this whole state of health and well-being, so now I get to work with chronic pain patients, opioid addicts, Alzheimer's patients, general population, so medical students, National Guard, just normal everyday people. So we're trying to optimize performance for all these people, and there's lots of different ways to do that. And that's why I wanted to kind of bring all of that together. So no matter who you work with, I know a lot of us are focused on athletes in this room, but we've talked about coaches. Like, we got to take care of our coaches. We got to take care of our own practitioners. We got to take care of a lot of people. So how do we start navigating that space? So that's my why of why I'm doing all of this. And we had a great talk yesterday about, just understanding, like, why are you doing this? And so I'm doing it to help all those populations. Like, I'm more fired up than I've ever been to be able to help all those populations, and no barriers. Like, if you tell me we need to do research in PTSD or TBI, we're going to do it. I'm going to find a way to do it. But now getting into the practical, like, that's great to have this grand vision and let's just do it, but there's practicality to it. So how do we start kind of stepping through all of these different ways and ultimately getting in the technology space and picking the right things and doing the right things? But you got to understand that before. So let's take a step back and really understand that. So as we talk about, great talks yesterday saying, hey, we want valid devices. We want third-party testing. We want scientifically backed things. And I think we would all in this room agree to that. Like, we want science-based decisions on what we're trying to do. Do we have scientifically backed data behind all of this? No, absolutely not. Does some of it have some? Yeah. Does some of it have none? Yeah. But we're all responsible to kind of step through this space. So you can't just kind of push it off to somebody else and say, hey, you just tell me, unless you're the ultimate boss that doesn't have time to do it. I think we're all responsible for this. So as I start, now that I'm in academia, I got to be a little bit more philosophical about things. So I've had a chance in this last year to really kind of look at the sports science space and kind of where are we at. And it's been kind of mind-boggling to me for years, and Jimmy and I have talked about this a lot, is like, you've got an NCAA university, and you've got brilliant minds all across that university. You have great athletics across the university. They rarely ever talk to each other, right? So great minds, great athletes, they don't talk. Like, athletic departments will go somewhere else and go to companies to get things. And there's a reason for that. It's not like this is an anomaly, and it happens all over the place because we talk different languages. So on the left side, and I'll dog on scientists all day because I am one, so the focus of, and this is generalized, but I think it's generally true. So a scientist in academia, like, their priorities in their careers it's effectively basic science, but they're judged on peer-reviewed publications. And so those are journals, and we're lucky that we have tons and tons of science and journals and evidence-based stuff to read. It's really hard to get things published. It's a ton of work, and it requires a lot of money. So in order to get those publications, you have to bring in grants. So to get grants, you go to places like NIH and NSF who have things that they're looking at, right? So they're looking for basic science. They're looking for cancer research and Alzheimer's research. All that has to be done. That's amazingly important. But the amount of money that's available for high-performance research, it's not a lot, right? So now we have to think about trying to meet the objectives of what a scientist needs to get to what we need to get that scientific-based evidence behind everything that we're trying to do. And then ultimately, they're looking for tenure, which you need grants and peer-reviewed publications to do that. And Jimmy's one of the best at this, where he kind of took a different perspective, and he was like, I'm just going to work with athletes. Like, he's got the lab, he's got the grad students, and the same thing that we're doing at West Virginia is we have a coaching science program, and we have interns and kids that have to do practicums and have to learn technology and do stuff. So guess what? You're going to work with athletes. You're going to measure things in the lab. You're going to do things, and we're going to try to translate some of that within the context of education. And then a lot of things that we're trying to do on the DoD side is, there's a little bit of money there for high performance, but not compared to how much money we put into F-35s. So it's staggering how little we put into protecting our military members from high performance perspective based on everything else we put in. So just kind of understanding where they're coming from. Not to mention they talk a different language. So most times professors will talk way over your head, and they won't understand anything about what the practitioner needs because they don't go and talk to the practitioner, right? And the same side is, like, practitioner rarely talks to the scientist because we're talking different languages. So there's outliers to that, of course. But now on the practitioner side, as we've heard the last couple of days, you got to win today. Take care of your athletes. Like, if I'm going to use something, it better make a difference today. And we all know in the scientific realm, and talked about it yesterday, you need 2 good years of data to do some objective things in science, but you can't go to a coach and say, I'm going to do that, give me $200,000, I'm going to do this for 2 years, and then I might tell you an answer. Like, that's not going to fly, right? So we have to pick and pull. That's where I think this sports scientist role is critical. So being able to talk those different languages and being able to tie those two things together, and we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end of, really I think the goal of a sports scientist is you need to create tons and tons of applied research studies that happen all the time. You need to take this data, and as Mark mentioned, like, we're lucky. We have all this technology that now we can take technology out of the lab and take it to them. So we need to take it to them, help them design studies, and understand that we don't have complete control. So to do a normal publication with bringing in subjects and controlling for nutrition and all these different things, we don't have control over that. So just understanding what we control, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you would think that Bob, like, his master plan was for us to all talk about Simon Sinek. And I thought I was really cool coming up with this, and like, I'd blow your minds knowing about this, but we all know about it. But this kind of hit one of the strength coaches, Daryl Bauer at West Virginia. He sent this to me, I don't know, probably 10 months ago, right when I started. And so this is how they helped define what their program was. And I think this is important to kind of drill down of, you've got to understand these things before you dive straight into technology. So if you're like maybe one of the two people in the room that hasn't seen this, it's a 2009 TED Talk, but it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, holy cow, if we don't understand how to define that for our organization, like, we're going to be pretty lost. So I wanted to kind of divide up the perspective of this talk of kind of stepping through that from a sport technology point of view. And I'll point out, from sports performance, one of the best. So I got, again, completely lucky that when I moved to West Virginia, I didn't know anything about the football program or the staff or anything there, and I just jumped into a scenario where they had this amazing culture already built, and it's Daryl Bauer and Mike Joseph that did it. And I walked into it, and Daryl has this amazing performance optimization chart, and it's his, so I'm not showing it here today. We will at some point, but it's how they communicate with the athletes and communicate with the coaches. And it's a detailed optimization chart that says, hey, they got cryotherapy, we put in photobiomodulation, we're putting in a float tank, we're doing all this amazing stuff. You got catapult, you've got Whoop sleep devices, you got all this stuff, and an athlete's gonna be like, why do I have all this stuff? What does that do? But they've created this culture, like they know exactly where everything ties in and everything interrelates, and fatigue management and how this tells me about this, and it's all about optimizing the athlete and taking care of the athlete. And without that and communicating that to the athlete and the staffs, like, you just think you're doing 100 things. And I've seen that at other places where I've had athletes just flat revolt and just rip stuff off their bodies and throw it across the room because they don't understand why they're wearing it. Why am I wearing an external load monitor when you're just going to crush me in practice every single day? Because that communication isn't there, and you have to always talk to the athlete and say, hey, this is why we're doing it. And it's great when an athlete comes in and just asks questions. Like, I had an hour-long conversation with Will Greer. Like, he wanted to know everything about his data and heart rate variability, and because he's super into it, and he understood it. But being able to be there and talk through it and say, hey, this is what it means, and this is where everything is mapping out. Like, you want every athlete to be like that, and not everyone will be. But just kind of being able to communicate that with every dynamic. So that's so far in my athletic career, that's where I've seen it done best. So what I want to do is take one concept, and obviously I didn't come up with this, but this really hit me when I was reading this book. The references down there, Callis in 2016. If I want to take care of all these populations, right? If I want to think about everybody in the room, how do we optimize performance for everybody? Is there something that can define a majority of the people that we're working with? And it's the recovery stress state. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to recover from whatever stress we've induced on whoever we're working with. So if it's a head coach, they have a massive amount of stress, cognitive stress, probably not as much physical, so they're probably not working out, they're probably just grinding 16, 20 hours a day and just getting crushed all the time. So how do you understand the stress that they're taking in and recover them from that stress? You've got a Major League Baseball athlete, right? They have different levels of stress. They've got physical stress. They also have psychological stress. Everybody's got home stress. So how do we now start understanding, how do we measure all those different things? So psychological, physiological, social stressors, quantify those, and come up with a comprehensive recovery plan. And so how I try to educate, new teams or something like, where we're trying to understand this recovery state and stress state, this is the bad side, right? So this is what happens in athletes when we become under-recovered, overtrained, and burnt out, right? So if we don't do that right, and we don't understand the training loads that we're applying and don't understand their recovery state and how their body's adapting. So as Mark said, like, just simply putting a GPS device on an athlete, that only gives you a very small picture, a very expensive one, but a very small picture of what's happening. That's the mechanical work that athlete's doing. Doesn't tell you anything about the internal work their body took to do that. Doesn't tell you anything about physiologically how did the body adapt to that, and what are they ready for the next day. So we really need to start, and I like that the 4 different buckets that Mark put it in. It's like, well, you need to understand all those different things to start looking at this, and we're trying to prevent all these things on the right from happening. So to me, it's all about comprehensive monitoring. So how do we start defining, and you have to do this for each of your individual groups, but I'll break it down into an example group of how we start doing this. So let's start understanding how we look at this and how we monitor it. And so I'm huge on recovery, and it's because of all the influences of the groups that I've worked with and all of my mentors as well. But one of the reasons that I came to this is, I work with a lot of different populations, but that's what cuts across every single one of these. And kind of the first experience I had with Ohio State was, we're understanding training load, we're doing Zephyr, Zebra, all this great stuff, but training load is not going to change, right? Urban's he's going to work them hard every day, and it's probably not going to change. So just knowing that's not going to change, and in some military groups, like, you're not going to tell somebody not to train today, or you're not going on a mission, you're not doing this. So that's out of the question for these groups. Maybe it's not for your group, and soccer is different, so soccer will modify their training loads, but the thing that's pervasive across all of them is recovery. So there is some white space at the end of the day. So there are things that we can do that you can optimize your recovery to put your body in the best position to take on that training load that you're going to do that next day if you can't modify it. If you can, that's awesome. So let's talk about the how. So now if we think about this recovery stress state and how we're digging into it, the how and there's a lot of different ways that I've seen this, and a couple yesterday is our how and how we do this is measure, assess, and move. So we want to measure, and we're lucky with all these wearables and all these technologies and getting it out of the lab, we can now measure all these different things. There's lots of different ways to do it. It depends on what your group is looking to do. So measuring it's one thing, and we'll talk about how you get valid technology and test technologies to do that. Assessing it is a whole another ball of wax. There is understanding what that data means and putting that context in. And I'm really glad Mark brought that point up in his 4 segments earlier, and I forgot to put this in there, is that's one of the critical pieces of data too, is like if you have all this data, like if you don't have something that defines performance or something where a coach says this is how you performed or how an athlete performed, we're in trouble because you're only going to be able to cross-correlate between training load and heart rate variability and sleep, which is interesting, but we're looking for overall performance. So that's really critical too. And that's one of the best things we did at West Virginia this year is we've got all these great iPad kiosks everywhere and we're monitoring tons of data. And we kind of put this in right before the season of like right when they're weighing out at the scale, the Bluetooth streams their weight up. It was just, we did our training load RPE. We did a 1 to 10, like how do you feel like you performed today? And again, when we talk about an athlete can lie about that, it's trust between the coach and the athlete. Like, hey, we're doing this. I want to know objectively how you think you performed today. And if you put a 4, like head coach isn't going to see that. Strength coach is going to see that. And we're going to be able to correlate and say, hey, let's see what's going on. Like maybe you're under-recovered or maybe we need a nutrition or hydration intervention, something like that. So spinning it always in the positive for that athlete. But then that allows us to correlate. Like, I care how you feel like you performed. And it's simple. It's 1 to 10, but that's really critical data. And I won't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but the whole objective, like you do measure and assess well, so what? If we don't do something about it, then we shouldn't be doing this, right? So the whole training interventions and recovery interventions, that's a whole nother couple hours on that, but we need to be able to get to that and make those decisions. So let's just talk about a typical day in the life of an athlete. So I'm not going to talk about, we had great talks on biomechanics and other tests that you might do weekly or monthly or blood draws or things like that. I just want to look at the day in the life of an athlete. So you wake up in the morning and you wake up with some sort of stress response based on acute to chronic workload and stress and all these other things, but you're kind of waking up in a starting state. So now we've got early in the morning readiness to train or readiness to perform, however you want to define that word. It really doesn't matter. And this can be an athlete, this can be an executive, whatever. So readiness to train, a lot of the metrics that can go into that are understanding what your acute to chronic training load was leading up to that, heart rate variability, which I'll talk about in a second, the subjective data that Mark talked about is incredibly important. What training phase are you in? Like, do I expect you to be crushed today because of what I did to you yesterday? Like, understanding that context is really important. Because just because you see some red scores, maybe you're supposed to be red, right? Not supposed to be green every day because then we're not pushing you hard enough. So once we understand all that in the beginning of the morning, then at some point of the day you're going to train, right? So it's physical training, it's cognitive training, it can be classwork, whatever it is, you're now undergoing some stress, and we want to measure that stress. And as Mark talked about, we've got internal workload and external workload, and we've got weight room, and we've got lots of different ways that we can measure this, and we'll go through some of those technologies. So then once you get done with that training, now it's time to recover and get prescriptive about that recovery. So looking back at all of that data and now incorporating the workload data and incorporating rate of perceived exertion, which is incredibly powerful and super simple, heart rate variability again, and understanding all of the context of that. How do we get prescriptive about recovery? And then finally, we've got sleep. And we'll talk about that some more. That's the most critical part of the day, and we need to understand that better. So if we now start thinking about that from a perspective of, let's look at readiness to train, subjective wellness, there's very simple ways to do this. And so now we've all got smartphones, we've got apps that can do this. And I like to talk about this, like if you're at a small university and you don't have any money, like there's ways to do all of this for free, right? So pen and paper and Microsoft Excel can do all of this. It's great to have shiny AMS platforms and apps and all this stuff. Like I love it, it looks great, it's easy to use, but you don't have to have it to do it. But this is the way that we do it. So we deploy app-based questionnaires for some of our teams where now you're looking at sleep, subjective, right? So sleep, hydration, fatigue, and you can set up these questions however you want, and there's good standards for doing that. You can provide scoring, descriptors, all these different things there. It's really important on the top right-hand corner as understanding soreness and understanding any issues going on in the body. And this is a communication tool. And one of the best in the business I've seen at this is Steve Tastian at the Columbus Crew. And the reason this is so successful for him is because he cares so much about the data, and he will talk to every single one of his athletes. Like if something's different in their data, he'll actually have a conversation with them and say, hey, I see that your hamstring's kind of flaring up, or you got an old injury that's flaring up. Talk to me about it, or your sleep has dipped, is something going on? And showing that athlete that you care about that data and you're looking at it. It's not a black box. Like if it's a black box and they don't hear from you for 6 months, they're gonna not comply with this. They're probably not gonna be honest about it. If you punish them for not doing it, then that's gonna create a negative connotation too. So super simple, lots of different ways to do it, but that's the way we kind of look at that subjective status. I do wanna point out a couple of papers. Definitely the one on the left is an awesome paper from Anasol, and it basically just talks about all the different ways to use self-reported measures and some evidence on how that can even be better than some technologies. And that's kind of the thing about the scientific space. Like for every paper that you read that says one thing, I can find you a paper that's going to say the exact opposite, right? Except for a couple of scenarios, but we'll leave politics out of it. But anyway, so you just have to kind of trust some of the things that you read, and if that fits in with your culture, and if it's a peer-reviewed publication and trusted authors, then those are good things. And it's all valid data. It's just how you want to utilize it for yourself. So let's talk about heart rate variability as kind of a second segment in this. So for those of you that are not familiar with heart rate variability, this is not heart rate. This is a 3 to 5 minute measurement typically, first thing in the morning right after you wake up. And it's understanding the parasympathetic and sympathetic dominance of your autonomic nervous system. So this is now a quantitative measure of how did your body adapt to that workload and how ready are you to do these things today. So if you're sympathetic, your heart's beating like a metronome, like the one on top. Parasympathetic, you have a natural variability to your heart. You can be overly parasympathetic as well. But my point is with the technologies today, like we can quantitatively measure this. So this, to me, this is critical information. So I would want to do this on as many athletes as I can do this on as far as technology is allowed. There's some technologies that's like for $10 you can do this on your athletes. There's more expensive ones that have different bells and whistles to it as well. And this is why we care, because I'm trying to set your body up to positively adapt to that workload I'm going to give you. And if physiological, your body's in the right state to do that, and I can measure that through subjective and heart rate variability and all this stuff, like that's critical information. I want to know that. So talk about now moving from the readiness to train, now you start training. This is another really great paper. Basically just looking at monitoring athlete training loads and all the different ways to do it. This is a consensus paper, tons and tons of great references in here. So I highly recommend reading that to kind of get a start on training load. We've got 1 to 10. It's incredibly well published. Again, it can be free, paper and pen, or you can do it based on an app or however you want to do it. And it's literally, and I think this is great because it's a good standard. So if you think about you got GPS devices on your athletes, that's just taking the training load on the field. So you're not taking training load in the weight room. You're not taking psychological load, other different ways to do this. But now if you look at every single session of stressor that they're doing, you can now understand that workload subjectively from that athlete with no technology, cheap, even free if you want to use it. Now sleep. I'll talk about a study that we're doing here in a second, but sleep I think is the number one thing wrong. So we need to understand quantity and quality of sleep. So in the room, how many people think they know how much sleep they get every night, whether you're wearing a device or not? Like, do you keep track of how many hours roughly sleep you get a night? Okay, not enough, but that's good. That's not good. But if I told you that every single human being needs 7 hours of sleep every night to physiologically recover on average from everything that they've done, and that's every human being, how many of you think you're getting more than 8 hours of sleep a night? Okay, a couple. More than 7? Okay, less than 7? All right, so I think a lot are that less than 7. So it could be that you're an elite sleeper and you need, like John Gruden says, he gets 4 hours of sleep a night. I don't think it's working out too well for him. But if you're an elite sleeper, you can cope on 6 hours of sleep a night. How many people think they're an elite? They're one of those genetically elite sleepers that gets less than 7 hours. The simplest thing you can do is give yourself 8 hours of a sleep opportunity every night. Be in bed for 8 hours every night. Like, whatever happens, sleep-wise, quality while you're there, like, you've got to at least start there, because if you're only giving yourself an opportunity for 6 hours, you're going to get less than that, right? So you've got to at least start from there, regardless of technology. And you heard great talks yesterday on why we need sleep and all that stuff. And I thought this was a great paper from Andy Murray. This is a simple survey paper, and this is looking at NCAA athletes and all of the different recovery modalities that they have, so cold water immersion, nutrition, sleep, cryotherapy, all this stuff, just asking them what they thought was the most important. And they rated at 88% that sleep was the most important recovery tool that they had. But then when they asked them, how many of these things you actually use, only 24% of them said they use sleep as a recovery tool, right? So they know it's important, but they're not using it as a tool. So we're kind of eliminating the most important thing that we can be doing. All right, so the what of all this. So now I've at least outlined some things that are important. So training load, subjective stuff is easy. So let's talk about technology. Training load, heart rate variability, and sleep. So when we look at technology evaluation, I kind of grouped it in these 3 categories. So as a scientist, it's like 100% data quality. Like it's got to be 100%, or even like Mark said, it's got to be within 3% error, which is pretty tight, which I agree with. But that's the only focus of a scientist. Now you take an administrator. This is what they care about from left to right in general. Like, how much does it cost? That's all they care about. How much does it cost? And then they might care about logistics in terms of cost. Like, if I need somebody to run it and it's going to cost me hiring somebody, that's what I care about. And they care least about data quality. So where I think a sports scientist sits is we need to care equally across all those things. And me, as evaluating new technology, I'm kind of more like an administrator. Like, I'm going to ask cost first, because if it's the greatest thing in the world but it costs me $1 million, I can't use it. Like, I don't want to get excited about it. I don't want to, even if I know it's the greatest thing in the world, and I'll go to my football coaches and say, hey, I got the greatest thing in the world, but it costs $1 million, and be like, get out of here. That doesn't help me, right? So, but then the other important thing that was talked about yesterday is logistics. So again, if it's decent cost and decent quality, but it's a pain to use, and we've got sleep sensors on our athletes, and the visualization is great, motivation is great, data quality, I'll find out about soon. But logistically, the battery lasts a day, day and a half, and it flips over at night, and like half our athletes have trouble with it, and it doesn't always sync. So that's an issue. Like, if we don't get the data every day, that's an issue. So you can have all those things nailed, but if you miss on logistics, that's a big thing. So we have to take all these different things into account. So data quality is huge, and Mark talked about it as well. So garbage in is garbage out. So if you've got, even if you nail visualization and nail logistics and nail getting all your data aggregation in, if the data is wrong, I can make analytics do anything. I can find a correlation if I look hard enough in anything, but if the data is wrong, I'm going to give you the wrong answer. So that's why data quality is important. And maybe I'll put a quick plug in here for data quality, is that something that hit me a few months ago was, and as Mark mentioned, like, he's got his kind of 3% rule, but it's changing now. This is not FDA regulated stuff, right? So there's nobody telling us how accurate this needs to be. And to his point, like, does heart rate need to be 10% accurate? So my plug is one of my grad students is doing a survey study, and hopefully it'll get to you guys. So if you see an email coming from West Virginia University, don't throw it in your trash. I want to know, is there a consensus with practitioners with all these different technologies, what's acceptable? And do we know? So I can tell you all day long how accurate something is, but if we don't have a consensus on how accurate it needs to be, that doesn't help you select that technology. So that's something that'll be coming out soon, and really, really and we want to break it down to every different type of practitioner, every different group that you're working with, and just understand, is there a consensus? And if there is, this is what it is, and help us with those decisions. I'll take you, running out of time a little bit here, but I want to take you through 3 studies that we're doing. So this one's about to be published, and I've said that a lot of times, but I mean it this time. But this was one of the first things that we looked at back in my Air Force lab. We just finished up all the data on it. But really it was kind of looking, if anybody's got a watch that glows green on the back, which I think a lot of us do, that's PPG-based heart rate, right? So that's giving you heart rate. And anybody that's done a hard workout with that device has probably noticed that it's pretty wrong. So that's what we want to do is we want to take kind of all these PPG-based devices and just look at the accuracy of those versus EKG trusted heart rate. And for this study, we used Polar. So Polar is the industry standard. Polar's been published against 12-lead EKG. They got to be practical about the way we do studies. So I won't get into a lot of details on this, but basically what we did is we had a cardio cycle and a high-intensity interval cycle with subjects back at the lab. And the cardio cycle was treadmill running, stationary bike cycling, and rowing. And physiologists designed, and we had their VO2 maxes, so we know their max heart rates, and basically coached them through getting your heart rate up and down in certain zones for 20 minutes. So we hit a lot of different zones in it. And then high intensity interval was basically just 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off of a lot of different push-ups, pull-ups, all sorts of different things, and just looked at literally beat-to-beat accuracy of all these different things. And so this is kind of the highlight of that, and it's what I expected, but I wanted to see it is kind of top from bottom. This is looking at basically the mean beat-to-beat difference between all those different activities, and chest-based EKG devices are the most accurate, which we would assume. So you kind of see a lot of the wrist-based ones are kind of at the bottom, and there's some, I mean, if you look at that, there's some wildly inaccurate ones. Like you could be, and those are beats per minute, so you can be 70 beats per minute off with some of those devices, so that's a big deal, right? But there's nothing telling us what that needs to be, so that's where the survey is going to be important. So yeah, wrist-based PPG devices, and any company that's being honest with you will tell you that that's the fact, like it's motion artifact. There's a class action lawsuit against Fitbit, like we know these things. But how accurate does it need to be? So if you're training an athlete on the field, really accurate. If I'm trying to get an opioid addict to move more and exercise, it doesn't need to be. I just need to know that they're moving and exercising. Some of the in-ear ones are really interesting. The Under Armour JBL one came out really well, and a little bit better than the Jabra, but I think a lot of that is in fit. So I think that's a great place to do heart rate, but it's got to fit right, I think is the key thing behind that one. And that'll come out soon. So I'll take you through heart rate variability study that we're doing right now. So we're about halfway through our subjects. So basically the two different ways that you can do heart rate are you've got EKG-based waveforms. So you see the nice QRS peak there. So again, we're looking at beat-to-beat variability on a millisecond time scale. So now you look at what the waveform looks like when it leaves your heart and gets all the way down to your wrist or your finger, wherever you're doing it. Now you see this really smooth, that's how it's getting your heart rate. So we're trying to pick out that beat-to-beat on a millisecond time scale, but now on this really smooth curve. So that's basically the big differential between these two. So we're testing all these different devices right now versus EKG. And so, like I said, we're halfway through the subjects. We'll be done with that soon, and we'll get that published out there. But it's really looking at, there's a lot of different EKG-based devices out there. We want to know how accurate those are. There's some that you may know on your phone, like you can put your finger on the back of the flash of your phone and get HRV. So we're testing a lot of those. So I'll let you know kind of how that turns out. I kind of think I know, but I'll let my data scientists tell me that. There's other important things about when you do your measurement, right? So some devices will give you the measurement while you're sleeping. Well, there's studies that show that has nothing to do with your ANS system readiness. So sleep, your parasympathetic system saturates when you sleep. So you need to do it when you wake up. And every study is done based on waking, aroused heart rate variability. So if there's a device that tells you what it is when you're in your deepest sleep, that's probably an issue. So let's talk about sleep a little bit and how important this is. So anybody sleep with this every night? So if you want to know exactly what's going on in your sleep staging, I can't say that definitively because, again, we're halfway through the study. But, I mean, that was me for 25 days, so I was the first subject. So it wasn't sleep lab, but it was a take-home FDA-approved sleep profiler device. Understanding exactly what the sleep staging is, which is so critical to understanding. Yeah, I want to know how long you're in bed and how long you're asleep, but understanding that all those different stages that we talked about in the sleep presentation yesterday, that's critical because your deep sleep is the most restorative sleep that you need. I know we always kind of harp on REM sleep and dreaming sleep, but that deep sleep, like if you tell any athlete I can increase your HGH levels, they'll probably be like, yeah, I want some of that. Well, increase your deep sleep, and that's literally what your body is doing. But I need to understand what's going on. And so you get all that deep sleep in the beginning of the night, then you start catching up on your REM sleep at the end of the night. So understanding that, and then looking at athletes, like if you shift your sleep, and like some of those hockey athletes from yesterday, like if you normally go to bed at 9, all of a sudden you're going to bed at 3 in the morning, you actually miss out on that deep sleep. So now you front load your REM sleep, and I don't know why that is. I'll have to ask a sleep physiologist that. But now you're losing the most important restorative physical sleep. And we only know that if we can measure this well. So the basic different types of devices are actigraphy. So these are all of your wrist devices. are just giving you movement, right? And so the ones that'll be honest with you will say, I can give you how much you're sleeping, but I can't give you sleep staging. So that's a good way to look. And then there's other ones that underneath your mattress. So my grad student thought this was magic when I showed it to him, but it's ballistic cardiography. And underneath your mattress can actually, from frequency measurements, it can actually measure your heart rate. So we're testing all of these. And I got to wrap it up here, but this is our sleep study that's going on right now. So we're halfway through this one, and again, we'll get that data out as fast as we can, but these are all the different devices that we're testing. And so we're using this sleep profiler device, so it's FDA approved from advanced brain monitoring. So that's how we're getting 100 nights from a bunch of different subjects. So wearing that EEG all night, and I used to have permanent EKG imprints on my forehead, but they went away. But that's kind of our standard behind that. So I think I'm out of time, and I had some more things that I want to talk about, but I didn't do good on time management. But I just wanted you guys to know, so, we talked about yesterday, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if there was a third-party validation center for all of this stuff? And the good news is that's our place, right? So that's one of the fundamental things that we're doing at the Rockefeller, on top of a lot of other things, is we're going to do that validation. And literally, I'm going to buy everything on the market unless it's just completely weird, and I'm going to test it out. So I'll rip through these so you have my email address. Yeah, I had a little bit too much to talk about. Oh, no. But anyway, so please reach out to me. Like, if you have a new technology that you're interested in, hopefully, like, if you email me and ask me about it, we already know and we've already tested it. If we haven't, we will look at it within reason. Like, as long as we can test it and do gold standard measurement against it. I've got lots of students that need to learn. So please reach out to me, ask me anything. We've got a lot of other great stuff on data visualization and data analytics that I didn't get to talk about, but I'd love to chat with you guys. So.
Okay, so we talked a lot about the why, what, how of sports science when it comes to physiological monitoring and wearable technologies and physio data. Talked about the importance of building a culture, and then when it comes to understanding what you need to measure that's going to make an impact on your athletes or your operators, how to then select those technologies to meet those needs. And I think we're at an exciting time right now that there's a lot of companies that are making some really interesting products and really pushing the edge of what we can do with our athletes. But we need to be diligent and make sure that we're selecting the technologies that are going to make a difference for the people that we work with, have high data quality, have good logistics of being able to implement it if it's every day or every week. It's got to make the coaches' lives easier and not harder. So having said all of that, let's say that we've now selected all of the important pieces of data that we need. The technologies are going to be able to do that, and you've implemented this program. Now really is where the fun starts, and what do we do with this? And I've worked with a lot of groups to where, now we have a lot of data, but what are we going to do with it, and how do we make it actionable? So I want to talk through some things on data visualization, a little bit on data analytics, and how to put that data to use. And really, a lot of what is going to drive the day-to-day interaction with data from coaches is data visualization. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. And data visualization is really, I feel it's an equal blend of art and science. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I know a lot of people are coming from different backgrounds, and you might be at a big Division I university that's got a lot of resources or professional team. Or maybe you're from a smaller school, and there's different ways to do it. And the good news is, if you're at a smaller place, there are ways to do it essentially for free. And we talked about things like subjective wellness and RPE. You can do those by hand if you have to, and then you can use Microsoft Office tools. So Excel being the workhorse for that, and PowerPoint and Word to be able to do your reporting. And so it's all feasible, even if you have a budget of close to zero. It's just going to require a decent amount of day-to-day interaction and a lot more kind of daily hand jamming of data and putting it in and making those spreadsheets, but it's absolutely doable. The other side of things that I want to talk about are what we call AMSs, or athlete management systems. And these are ways to, just imagine you've got maybe 5 different technologies that you've got running with your team, or 5 different data sets coming in. Instead of kind of the traditional route where you've got them all going to separate Excel files or separate databases, or maybe it's on paper and trying to aggregate that every single day. And I've gone into a lot of places where it's literally just thousands of Excel files and trying to make sense of that. Now these athlete management systems are really designed to implement all of that data. And there's different ways that you can pull in data. And something as simple as you can directly input it. So if you're doing, say, caliber body fat measurements, you can directly input it into the system, or something incredibly more complicated, something like a GPS system that could have maybe 500 different variables for each athlete. And you can export a giant CSV file and then import that in with a couple of clicks into an athlete management system. And the other way that's much preferred, if possible, is something called an API, Applied Programming Interface, where these technologies then directly interface with the athlete management system. So the way that our heart rate variability works, that we work with Omega Wave as a company, we work with predominantly on our HRV. Lots of other good technologies out there too. That's the one that we use. And so with the API, the athlete does their 3-minute measurement, clicks finish on the app, goes up encrypted to the Omega Wave cloud, and then that links directly to our athlete management system. And we use SMARTABASE by Fusion Sport for all of our work with our athletes and military groups. And then it comes directly down into SMARTABASE. And so it's really seamless for the sport coach or the strength coach, because they're just doing their measurement and it shows up magically. So that's the ideal way, but there are other ways. So if you have a brand new technology that comes in, a CSV, export then import are simple ways to get these in. So that's the way to actually, think about the workflow. That's going to be an important part of this, is making sure that you've got good ways to get data in there, and it's not a burden on your athletes, and it's not a burden on your coaches. We want to try to find ways to actually save time. So coaches are coaching, athletes are training, and doing less of hand jamming and putting things into Excel, uploading, all those things that take a lot of time and take you away from the floor. Now, once the data is in there, really from a coaching perspective, is how do we get you some immediate information? So some of the things that you'll want to see right away are compliance. So you want to see who's done what, and then see some quick indications of what are some pieces of data that I can action right now. And a couple ways to do that are looking at what we call front page reports and alerts. So these have been really valuable for us, especially on the alert side. But a front page is something you can go to and you can see immediately who's filled out their wellness questionnaires, or immediately who's synced their smartwatch, and then even have some pretty simple color coding for that. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at some easy wellness data points, and then just based on what they scored, a green, yellow, red of what's going on. And then the well-being score, which you see on the far right, is just simple subjective questions, 1 to 5 scaling, and then you get a total point score. So you can sort by those numbers. So you can auto sort. In this case, I have it worst to first, so you can look at, okay, who's reporting pretty low well-being score. So just as a pretty quick triage to kind of see who's put it in and are there any issues right now, that's a good way to do it. Probably the most effective thing that we've seen recently with our athletes is been helpful to the coaches is these automated email alerts. So we can basically set triggers. So whenever that piece of data is input that triggers an alert that's important to the coaches, we can immediately send an email. One example of really simplistic data but incredibly important is the weigh in, weigh out data that we do with our football team. So the coaches are interested in, when they weigh in for the day, how far away are they from their goal weight, and if they're more than 3 pounds away from their goal weight, they want an alert to show that. Conversely, probably what's more important than that is after practice, so we do pre and post. So if they lose more than 2.5% of their body weight, immediately an email alert is sent to strength coaches, nutritionists, so they can actually action that data. So examples of that, but just think about any piece of data that's coming in. Those automated email alerts can really alert you, because if you're coaching 100 athletes, how do you get alerted of something that's going on? And you set those thresholds and set those things. So it's a balance. You don't want alert fatigue and getting too many things in, but you also don't want to miss things as well. And really, one of the things that's been valuable to us is, again, all of the data coming into one place. So I'm not looking into 4 or 5 different systems and then trying to piece things together. And what that allows you to do is now overlay data from multiple data points. So you can look at training load and heart rate variability on top of each other, and wellness and sleep on top of each other, and really how those metrics start interrelating. That's where the interesting data comes in. So you're not looking at 5 different systems. You're looking into one system, and being able to immediately action that data is really the key to having these athlete management systems. And really the dashboard builders are where I spend a ton of my time. And that's, we're trying to help coaches make insights into their data really quickly. And one of the best ways to do that is through data visualization and creating these dashboards and having the power. Me as a sports scientist, I want the power to be able to click and drag and build things and have that conversation with the strength coaches and where they say, hey, I need to see this, this, and this. Can I see it this way? And then being able to build those things in real time and show them what it looks like is huge. And then me being able to be creative, and once I see data in there and say, I have an idea, what would this look like if I did that, and actually do it in real time and see it with real data, because that's, you can build all day long, but if you don't have real data to look at it and see what it looks like. So it's really all that power is in your hands to be able to create those custom visualizations and really drive it as a collaborative process between the sports scientists and strength coaches and maybe even sport coaches as well. So being able to really overlay the data and create custom dashboards is huge. Another thing that, again, is pretty simple, but has been very powerful for us is thinking about ways to, again, make meaning to this data. So back when I showed those, quick compliance alerts, so if I showed a poor rating on fatigue or a high fatigue score kind of relating to a red score, how do I know? Obviously, athletes, subjective data is subjective data. So I don't want to compare one athlete to another one. So one may always report high soreness, one may never report high soreness. So it's a very personal thing. And one way to really balance those things out and just make sure you're looking at an individual on their level and not comparing them to somebody else, which is important, especially with subjective data, sleep data, heart rate variability. That's critical. Training loads are different because you can get in. You might want to look at positional comparisons and kind of how they line up against their position. But one easy way to do that is a Z-score. And again, all these calculations we build directly into our athlete management system, and we can calculate means and standard deviations and the Z-score off of that. What Z-scores allow you to do is take a quick look at, okay, that's the score today. How many standard deviations away is that from that individual's personal norm? So I can instantly see, okay, this is high for them or this is low for them. And the way that we actually implement that are these visuals built through the dashboard builder and SmartAbase. And again, this has probably been one of the most effective visuals that we've had. And looking at examples of subjective wellness data here, so we're able to actually look at this from both a team perspective and an individual perspective. So I've got filters at the top of this page that I can select an entire team, I can select a position group, I can select a single athlete, and then it automatically updates all those graphs. So now I can drive into, I want to know what that athlete's trend has been, and I want to know what the team's trend has been. So if we look at this, looking at those bar graphs, think about the top one, that's your fatigue wellness score. So I'm able to see those yellow bars. So the one on the far right is the most recent piece of data. So what is that number and what is that value today? And it may be hard to tell, like, okay, that value is, maybe a 4.5, but is that high or is that low for that athlete? So we've got overlaid with that black line is the Z-score. So you see the straight line across the middle, that's a Z-score of 0, which means they're perfectly on their average. And above or below wherever that dot is how off their average is that day. So you immediately know what's going on with that athlete, what are their trends. So that's really important with subjective wellness data. Heart rate variability data, we've looked at this a couple of different ways, and HRV data can be pretty complicated and it's very athlete specific. So you want to make sure you're looking at it the right way. We had kind of an initial triage way to look at this since we have a lot of athletes using it, and a couple different visuals here where we look at one of these is more of a kind of team trends and compliance. So this one, basically from a very high level, one of our most important things that we're trying to do with heart rate variability is get you back into balance. So you can be in balance, you can be highly sympathetic or highly parasympathetic. Those are basically the different zones you could be in with heart rate variability. So the way that we've coded these just kind of with normal averages and normal ranges is if you're green, you're in balance. If you're light blue, you're highly sympathetic. If you're purple, you're parasympathetic. So this isn't a green, yellow, red because there's 3 different ways that you could be in. And we know what green is, and the other 2 are basically out of that balance. And with HRV, it's not just parasympathetic is your recovery score, but that's not one of those where the higher is always the better because you can be overly parasympathetic. So we want to have a nice balance between those 2. So right here, you can see a pretty quick indication of compliance. So basically the higher that overall bar is, the higher the number of athletes that have done their measurement that day. And then you can also see those trends of kind of from a high level, how many greens do I have, how many purples, how many blues do I have. So then you can drill that down into an athlete specific trends. And this is, so imagine you've got each one of those lines is a player with their name on the left. And then now you're kind of seeing what each one of those dates is on the right. And each one of those dots refers to what they've been at each one of those dates. So if, I try to make it really simple. So if there's 3 purples in a row, we want to go address that issue because now you have somebody that's chronically parasympathetic. And there are some recovery strategies that we have and training strategies that we have to try to get you back into green balance. What's good to have in these, if you're training hard, is good to have a lot of variation in your variation. So being all greens all the time means you can probably tax the system a little bit more depending on the athlete in general, right? And so we're just looking for anything that happens a lot of days in a row, and that's what we want to start intervening. So again, this is kind of from a high level and being able to take pretty complicated data, looking at a lot of athletes and then drill in. So say we now want to drill into a couple specific athletes, then we can go to a very specific athlete dashboard. So I can now select that athlete and I can look at more time, historical trends at a more granular value or granular range here. And so looking specifically at the 2 most critical metrics for us in heart rate variability is that balance score, and then RMSSD is really the most standard HRV score that you want to be looking at. So balance in this visual that we've got is really, I tried to make this one simple as well. So we did a little bit of scaling, and basically the closer those 2 points are together, so that corresponds again to the colors on the other chart. The closer those 2 are together, the light blue and the purple, if they're overlaid on top of each other as some of those points are that you can see, that's a perfectly in balance. So that's kind of what we're striving for. However, depending on the training load, if you had a really hard training, I would expect you to be out of balance. So being able to now overlay these things and look at, and one of the ways that we visualize that the data with some of our teams is we've overlaid balance and RMSSD with training load and even subjective RPE. So if they had a really high training load, I would expect them to report a higher RPE. And then if I'm seeing a dip in the heart rate variability or high sympathetic value or stuck at a high parasympathetic value, and that corresponds to that training load, that's going to make me say, okay, well, yeah, it's off, but this is why it's off. So that's really, again, where the power of these dashboards is being able to overlay different, triaging. So taking 100 athletes and figuring out, okay, I want to look at these 5, and then going into there and saying, okay, if this is going on, now I go to this visual, and it's going to kind of lead me in like, okay, was it training load? Is it sleep quality? Is it fatigue? Is it soreness? What's going on with that to really help drive those conversations that you can have with your athletes? So that's a lot on the kind of readiness to train. If we think about the training stress balance, so really looking at any of your training load technologies, so your heart rate monitors for internal load, your session RPEs for internal as well, any GPS type devices for external workload. And there's some really good papers out there on how to look at training loads. And probably one of the best things that I was able to do with some coaches back at Ohio State was, was getting a lot of, obviously there's a lot of different technologies out there, and each one is going to call their training load something different. Like we had used Zephyr technology, and so they used a physiological load as kind of their training load score, and then a mechanical load as their mechanical score, whereas Polar uses training load. And so using different terminologies, and then you can apply these training stress balances to anything. So distance covered, any training load metrics like the Polar's training load, or high speed distance, high speed running, time in different heart rate zones. So we were getting a lot of training load type metrics, but it can be easily confusing to a coach, seeing like, okay, what's this one mean again, and how many times I had to write out the equation for physiological load. Is like, okay, we can simplify things by looking at training stress balance, and what that's looking at is your 7-day average of that variable over your 28-day average. And this is also this is TSB or acute to chronic workload ratio, are 2 different ways to look at this. And depending on your sport, like it doesn't have to be a 7/28. That's if you have really nice consistent data and you're training a lot and consistently. 7/28 is a really great way to do it. If you've got a sport like football, sometimes a 3/9 might be more realistic for that sport because of the ways that the week is really mapped out. But anyways, the easy part of this, and what some of the publications have shown, and this obviously isn't a hard and fast rule and has to be studied for each sport, but it really simplifies things. And what a lot of people are looking at with training load these days is you want that training stress balance or acute chronic workload ratio to basically be consistent. So you want to be, the rule of thumb is between 80 and 130. It's kind of a percent of your acute over chronic workload ratio. Anything higher than that, and you've really spiked your workload, so your chronic training load has not prepared you for that big spike in that acute workload that you've got. And conversely, if you're low on that, then you're low on your acute and you've had high chronic workload. So then when you build it back up and you spike back up, so really this is kind of an easy way to say, okay, we got complicated metrics and you don't have to know the equation, but we want to keep you kind of in that green value. And it's okay to train hard, but let's train hard consistently and not dip and dive through those. And then it becomes now applying these to different workload visualizations. So again, being able to, if you have systems that you can do both external and internal, now you can do fun things where it's looking at those on top of each other and ratios of those different two, and how their RPE combines with their mechanical workload, and looking at some other fatigue metrics in there. So really, kind of what I tried to lay out for you guys is looking at everything in that recovery stress state and how important the data visualizations are. So just selecting a technology gets you the first way through. Getting that workflow in and making sure it's not taxing your coaches and taxing your athletes too much is the second thing. And then driving your visualization so your coaches can actually make decisions. And again, this isn't meant to be like a completely automated Terminator kind of thing where it's saying like, this is exactly what you need to do. It's helping drive insights to those coaches so they can do, have those conversations with the athletes and do the things that they're good at. Really the last thing to kind of end this on is, what are some of the challenges that we've got in kind of the current state of sports science right now, and why are we not able to answer a lot of things that we want to answer, right away, and really, kind of looking at where the different people lie in this. So we've got scientists in academia, and we got practitioners on kind of both ends of this, and then the sports scientist is trying to put this together. So really, what I feel, there's a big opportunity here, and I know that. I love doing applied research, and I love trying to design studies that are agile and quick, and we can get these answers in the communities that we want to get them. So how do we do that? So I think we're all kind of have a common vision, working in this field of what are the ways that we could do that. And the good news is if you're doing this monitoring and you're using technologies and you're doing things in a good way, there's good ways to do this. And just wanted to kind of map out, some of the different ways to, effectively what we're trying to do is we're trying to design and execute constant and agile applied studies. So if you're a coach on the floor and you're collecting data, we have the opportunity to do this. So it's kind of taking, some things from science and that sports science, just kind of tying those things together and understanding the current state of the literature, but then also talking to the coaches and what do we need to answer? What do we not know? And how do we take the data that you're collecting already and ideally not modify a lot in what you're doing and get these answers? So really, kind of the first thing is the understanding phase. So figuring out what your priorities are and what you want to actually try to figure out and what you're missing. And then kind of digging into the current state of the science and looking at, different things that can kind of lead you to, like, do we really not know anything about this, or has somebody already done it? There's, the good is there's tons and tons of science out there. The bad is you got to have the time to read all of it or stay up on it. It's impossible. There's too much knowledge out there, but really trying to do your best and something very specific you're looking into. The answers are probably out there. It can kind of get you to that. And one of the things that we hear a lot, and it gets me excited, is anecdotal evidence and testimonials. And I hear all the time an N of one, N of one, N of one. And while that you tell that to any scientist and they're like, that's not valid. That's kind of where there's smoke, there's fire. And when I hear that from a couple of different places, like, hey, this thing seems like it's really working, and our athletes are really responding well to this, and I've all these different stories of, hey, this happened to me with this. That's when we really start getting curious and like, okay, I've heard that from a few different places. Let's start looking into it, and let's try to kind of design more of a study around that anecdotal data. And then kind of that middle part is the controls. So now if we understand some things that we want to test, and we obviously know this is not a controlled study that you're bringing subjects in off the street and you're controlling for every single thing out there. This is the real world. So just understanding what's in your control, like what can you control about what these athletes are doing? And if something's not in your control, can you at least measure it? So if it's not in your control to control for training load, and they're going to do their training no matter what, which I think is going to be the case a lot of the times. Being able to measure that and just report that is going to be the valuable part of that. And the data analysis is really the key to all of this. And what I would say is, don't fear data analysis. It's not overly complicated. There are things that we can do, that anybody can do with their own data to start understanding things. But then having the right collaborations and resources to, really reach out and make sure that you've got the right number of subjects and get the right amount of data coming in, and you're doing it the right way, and you're looking at it statistically. So beyond means and standard deviations, but really getting into some things that we'll talk about here in a second, kind of a deeper level of understanding what we're looking at. So kind of to step you through just a couple of ideas on data analysis is, really taking that data analysis and driving action to it. And looking at the chief way I like to look at these is I call these kind of my monster correlation matrices. So I love to look at kind of a big old statistical blender and put in all of that physiological data, once it's cleaned up and once it's aligned, and really understanding like what are you trying to map this out to. So if I take a team sport, which is what I'll kind of show a generic example of, is okay, I have a team of athletes, and what do I really care about? I care about how they perform. If I'm looking at it from a team level for this particular sport, it's wins and losses, it's goals scored, maybe any other metrics that, goals given up, any other metrics I can kind of derive from that to get an overall team performance and kind of see like, okay, how in general, are there any statistical relationships with how these perform? And we do correlations there. So looking at statistical correlations and Pearson coefficients and basically those things where you would report that in a scientific publication saying, okay, these two things correlate together positively or negatively at a significant value, and looking at those. And so kind of looking at all those things, like, these can turn into massive matrices, and then going through one by one and saying, okay, does that make sense physiologically that this correlated to this, and is that something that we can actually drive action to? So we take that huge matrix and data set and, really try to map it out. And this is a visual that's been pretty successful for us to be able to, kind of take this at an end of a season analysis or end of year analysis. This is where that comes in handy is, all of those critical things that, this is what a coach cares about is right in the middle of that win. So all of those things are statistically relevant correlations that all map to winning the game for that team from a team perspective. And being able to look at that from like the day of the game. So whatever you're measuring on the day of the game, what are the things that correlated the day before the game, 2 days before the game, and then really kind of picking, because there will likely be a lot of things, but really kind of picking the things that have the strongest correlations, but then also the things that you can actually modify. Because if it's something that you have no idea how to change, then it's not all that worthwhile to look at. It may be interesting, but really looking at this is we saw drastic correlations in fluid intake the day before the game. So this was looking at a kind of a game day -1. Look at all of this and the soreness day of game and omega weight balance and central nervous system score and all the things that kind of tie into winning and losing. And so what's important with that is obviously that doesn't help you at the end of the season, but what we can do with that is now we take all that information and we drive those next level visualizations. So everything I showed with you, the data visualizations before, is really looking at like best practices and best ways that we know from literature and from experience and from other practitioners of, hey, look at it this way. But now if you have a year of data and 2 years of data and you can drive those nice correlations and say, this is what we know is important to us winning. And okay, 2 days before the game, this is what we need to be looking at. And who's flagging in those areas that we're worried about 2 days before the game. And then how do I change those things? So being able to drive visualizations like this one where we've got, no kidding, like green, yellow, red of what's going on here. And then what can I do about those things? So really, kind of want to leave it at that, and tying together. This is a really exciting time. We're lucky to be kind of working in this massive technology age where we've got lots of really great technologies. But instead of what I've done before is shotgunning and putting too many things, implementing too many things, and having the kind of shiny thing syndrome, really picking out the things that are going to make a difference. And we want to make sure that data is correct. We measure it the right way. It's accurate the way it comes out. We're diligent about what we're buying. And then, once we've got that data, driving those key visualizations, and at the end of the day, we need to understand what these things mean, and we need to understand how we modulate it and how we can help our athletes get better. So appreciate everybody's attention. Thanks a lot. My contact information is there on the slide, so please feel free to reach out. We're an academic institute, excited to work with lots of people. We got lots of exciting things ahead, so happy to chat anytime. Thanks.
Any questions?
I know you're not a cardiologist, but I heard a lot of heart rate variability stuff. With working with the populations that you guys have had, have you worked with that with anybody that has heart issues like atrial fibrillation or something like that, where they always have more variability, or have you found it through doing HRV stuff? And
yeah, it's a good question. We haven't, like on a health side, we haven't. But there are like very highly trained athletes have much different heart rate variability, like a higher normally resting heart rate variability. So there are norm differentials, but we haven't seen we haven't looked for any medical conditions, and we try to stay away from that. But that's a good point.
Any other? Oh, hold on a second. Here.
I guess I can start. So, Josh, great talk. First of all, you were obviously talking quite a bit about recovery. So, considering an environment like tactical, what methods or solutions have you experienced that can maybe compensate or support with the sleep and recovery lapses that we're experiencing? Yeah,
so that's a lot of the really, really great recovery stuff requires facilities and equipment, so that's front on our mind. So a lot of the stuff that I've learned from some of the military groups is flotation therapy is like the most magic thing that we've seen, and if anybody's had the chance to do it, or if you haven't, go find a place and do it. That's amazing from a holistic benefit, sleep benefits, stress reduction benefits. I'm really excited about photobiomodulation therapy, the red near infrared light. There's some good technologies for that that are coming on the market. Novathor is one that does whole body, and there's some competitors coming out to that. I think sleep hygiene and meditation and mindfulness, that's huge, because that's something you can take on the road and you can teach yourself. And I think that's probably the most critical thing that we can do is you've got to de-stress, and you have to do those things well, because I think it's all coming down to how do we optimize your sleep. Like if that's the number one thing that I can do, like I love all this fancy stuff, and I'd float every day if I could and do all of this stuff. But if you're tactical and you're operational, like what can I give you out there? And I can give you guided meditations. We're even thinking about trying to do like a virtual reality float tank where, yeah, it's probably not going to be as good, but if you can put Oculus Rift or something on your face and I can get you maybe like a 70% benefit of what I can get in a float tank, like those are things that we're trying to get to. So something I can actually deploy and you can take with you.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right, I'll be around. Happy to chat a little bit longer too. Thanks.